If someone had told Ferrari purists in the 1980s that Maranello was building a sports coupe with four-wheel drive, some of them would probably have called it a joke, or even heresy. At that time, Ferrari meant mid-mounted engines, rear wheels fighting for traction, manual gearboxes, and direct contact between driver and machine. All-wheel drive was associated more with rallying, the Audi Quattro, the Porsche 959, or utility vehicles, than with an Italian supercar. And yet, between 1987 and 1988, Ferrari built two prototypes of the 408-4RM, the brand's first cars with four-wheel drive. They were not intended for sale. They were not meant to replace the 328 GTB, and they were not a classic motor show concept. They were a laboratory on wheels, a test of a new drivetrain, new materials, new body construction methods, and a new philosophy that came more than 20 years before the production Ferrari FF. The story of the Ferrari 408-4RM begins at a very interesting moment for the brand. In the second half of the 1980s, Ferrari's range included, among others, the Testarossa, the 328, and the freshly born F40. On one hand, the company was holding on to tradition and emotion. On the other, it was increasingly aware that the future would require new technical solutions. Around this time, the Ferrari engineering division was created to show that Maranello could not only build supercars and Formula One cars, but also sell engineering knowledge as an outside consultant, just as Porsche and Lotus did. Ferrari therefore needed a technology demonstrator, a car that did not have to be beautiful or commercial, but had to prove that the company could experiment with structure, aerodynamics, suspension, and drivetrain. That is how the 408-4RM project was born. A car that was not so much a successor to any existing model, but a showcase of capability. A very important figure in this story was Mauro Forghieri, one of the most important engineers in Ferrari history. For years, he had been responsible for the brand's successes in Formula One and sports prototype racing. In Maranello, he was associated with a racing mindset. Solutions had to be light, effective, and as simple as possible, because according to his philosophy, the things that are not there cannot break. After stepping away from direct leadership of the racing department, Forghieri became involved in more experimental projects. 4RM was one of them. Development was carried out under his supervision until the spring of 1987, before he left Ferrari. This explains the character of the car. It does not look like a classic Pininfarina showpiece, but rather like a technical research object built by people who cared more about traction, stiffness, weight distribution, cooling, and downforce than about impressing the public. The name 408-4RM itself was very logical. 40 referred to the engine displacement, around 4 liters. 8 indicated the number of cylinders, and 4RM was short for the Italian Quattro Ruote Motrici, meaning 4 driven wheels. In later years, Ferrari returned to this term with the FF, the first production Ferrari with four-wheel drive, but the root of both the name and the idea can be found in the 408. Interestingly, the project was not just a mechanical curiosity. Ferrari also used it to study new ways of building load-bearing structures. 2 examples were built, visually similar, but structurally very different. The first, red, completed in June 1987, carried chassis number 70,183. The second, yellow, completed in September 1988, carried number 78,610 and was much more advanced in terms of materials. The first red prototype had a structure based on steel, described as a welded shell or frame made from stainless steel elements. That alone was already an interesting experiment, because Ferrari was moving away from simple thinking about a classic tubular frame and was studying more modern structural solutions. The second, yellow example, however, was even more important. In its case, an aluminum structure was used, developed in collaboration with Alcan, one of the world's most important aluminum producers. The aluminum elements were joined with adhesive, and in some descriptions also with rivets, using advanced structural bonding agents. Today, that technology no longer sounds shocking, but in the late 1980s, it was very bold. Ferrari was effectively testing a solution that would only later become more common in production sports cars, and within the brand itself, it returned on a wider scale, only with the aluminum structures of the 360 Modena era. In the yellow 408, the aluminum construction was intended to deliver greater stiffness at a lower weight. According to descriptions, it was significantly lighter than the steel structure and also stiffer, which perfectly matched the aims of a research car. The central section formed a kind of strong cage around the cabin, to which the front and rear substructures were attached. The drivetrain was located at the rear, while the front housed parts of the transmission system and suspension. In both examples, the bodywork was made from composite materials, including fiberglass and layered materials. This, too, matched the experimental character of the car. Ferrari was not trying to create a mass production body here. It was testing how different materials could work together in the supercar of the future. That is exactly why the 408 4RM is so important. It was not only the first four-wheel drive Ferrari, but also one of the bridges between traditional Ferrari construction and the later era of aluminum and composites. The heart of the Ferrari 408 was a naturally aspirated V8 engine with a 90-degree bank angle and an exact displacement of 3,999.66 cubic centimeters. The unit was a development of engines known from the 308 and 328 family, but it was mounted differently. In the classic 308 and 328, the V8 engine sat transversely, while in the 408, it was mounted longitudinally. This solution previewed the direction later used in the Ferrari 348, which, as the production successor to the 328, received a naturally aspirated V8 mounted longitudinally. In the 408, the engine had a bore of 93 millimeters and a stroke of 73.6 millimeters. The compression ratio was 9.8 to 1. Maximum power was around 300 horsepower at 6,250 revolutions per minute, while torque was around 373 Newton-meters at 4,500 revolutions. The engine had 4 valves per cylinder, 2 camshafts in each cylinder head, Weber-Marelli electronic injection, and dry sump lubrication. The dry sump was important because it allowed the engine to be mounted lower, improving the center of gravity, while also providing better lubrication during high lateral loads. This is where Ferrari's racing mindset becomes visible. Even in an experimental road car, the engineers cared about elements typical of high-performance machines. The gearbox was a 5-speed manual, and the clutch was a twin-plate unit. Some descriptions suggest that the transmission was derived from solutions used in the 328, but its layout in the 408 had to be adapted to a completely different vehicle architecture. The engine was positioned in such a way that torque could also be sent to the front axle. This required an unusual arrangement of components, a longer wheelbase, and a very specific drivetrain layout. The most important element of the 4RM was, of course, the four-wheel drive system. Ferrari did not use a typical heavy system known from off-road vehicles. The system was based on a hydraulic clutch or hydrodynamic coupling that divided torque between the axles. Many descriptions mention a ratio of around 70% to the rear and 30% to the front. This allowed the car to retain a rear-drive character, while the front wheels could help transfer power, especially in more difficult conditions. The system used ZF differentials, and its advantage was supposed to be relative simplicity and low weight compared with more conventional setups. Ferrari also studied how the car behaved with different torque splits, how the additional drivetrain components affected weight, cooling, center of gravity, and vehicle response. These were questions the brand would return to many years later with the FF and GTC 4 Lusso, although the 4RM system used there was already a completely different and more advanced solution. The suspension of the Ferrari 4RM was also ambitious. It used an independent layout with double wishbones, coil springs mounted coaxially with telescopic dampers, and anti-roll bars. More detailed descriptions mention electro-hydraulically adjustable Marzocchi dampers, which allowed the ride height to vary from around 140 to 210 millimeters. This shows that the 408 was not just a mechanical prototype. Ferrari was also interested in adaptive chassis control, adjustable ride height, and how the car behaved in different conditions. The brakes were ventilated discs with 4-piston calipers. The Speedline wheels were 16 inches in diameter, with a central locking nut and a 5-spoke design typical of the period. The car had a wide track, broader than many Ferrari models of the time, which came from the need to ensure stability and make room for drivetrain components. In terms of dimensions, the Ferrari 4RM was compact, but not as small as it might seem. Length was around 4,220 millimeters, width around 1,885 millimeters, height around 1,200 millimeters, and the wheelbase was 2,550 millimeters. Interestingly, the wheelbase was quite long for a 2-seat Ferrari, because the drivetrain layout required extra space. Weight is quoted differently depending on source and configuration. Some figures mention around 1,100 kilograms, while others mention around 1,340 kilograms with fluids. This difference probably comes from the stage of development, the measuring method, and the differences between the two examples. Even if we accept the higher figure, the car was still fairly light for a 4-wheel drive vehicle with a 4-liter engine and experimental construction. Top speed is sometimes estimated at around 299 kilometers per hour, or almost 186 miles per hour, although it must be remembered that this was a research prototype, not a production model with a full official performance catalog. Stylistically, the 408 is one of the stranger Ferraris of its era. The body was designed in-house or with involvement from IDEA Institute, and construction was handled, among others, by Scaglietti. The car did not have the elegance of the Testarossa, the purity of the 328, or the brutal genius of the F40. It was angular, simple, functional, and somewhat technical. The front was low and wide, with a sharply sloped hood and different headlight solutions on the two prototypes. The red example had round lamps hidden under movable covers, which could give the impression of classic pop-up headlights. The yellow one received fixed lamps covered by transparent plexiglass covers. At the rear, there were horizontal lamps, but without Ferrari's classic motif of 4 round taillights. To some, the 408 looks ugly. To others, it is fascinating. But it must be remembered that this was not a car designed to become a style icon. Its bodywork was meant to carry technology, aerodynamic research, and cooling systems. Aerodynamics were an important element of the project. The body had a low drag coefficient, quoted in some materials as ranging from around 0.274 to 0.314, depending on configuration. At the rear, Ferrari used a movable spoiler or central rear wing element, controlled electronically or hydraulically, reacting to speed. This was a solution ahead of its time, because active aerodynamics in road cars remained rare for many years. The side air intakes differed between the two examples, suggesting that Ferrari was constantly testing different cooling and airflow configurations. The black cabin pillars and strongly curved glass gave the car a more unified, glass capsule appearance. The interior was more finished than one might expect from a purely technical prototype. It included sports seats, a wide central tunnel, a classic steering wheel, and a dashboard, whose layout previewed elements of the later Ferrari 348. So the 408 was not only testing mechanics, but also the ergonomics of future models. Why did the Ferrari 4RM never enter production? There were several reasons. First, the car was too experimental for Ferrari customers of the time. In the 1980s, buyers of Maranello supercars expected emotion, prestige, style, and traditional character. Four-wheel drive could have seemed like unnecessary complication and a departure from the brand's philosophy. Second, the 4RM system was heavy and expensive. Some information suggests that the all-wheel drive system alone may have added more than 200 kilograms, which conflicted with the idea of a lightweight Ferrari. Third, the Ferrari engineering project as an external consulting center lost momentum after Forghieri left. Since the main promoter of the idea was gone, the 408 remained more of a research object than a production candidate. Ferrari may also have decided that the traditional successor to the 328, the 348, would be the safer route. Modern, but still rear-wheel drive, and more in line with market expectations. Exactly 2 examples of the Ferrari 408 4RM were built. The red prototype from 1987 had a steel structure. The yellow prototype from 1988 had an adhesively bonded aluminum structure developed with Alcon. It is the yellow car that is best known today because it belongs to Ferrari's museum collection and has been displayed at the Galleria Ferrari in Maranello. The red example is shown less often, but it is also part of the project's history. In practice, there is no market for the Ferrari 408 4RM because these cars were never sold to customers. They are factory research prototypes with enormous historical significance, but they do not function like classic collectible Ferraris from series production. Their value comes not from racing results or beautiful bodywork, but from their breakthrough status. The first four-wheel drive Ferrari, an aluminum experiment, a preview of the 348, and a distant ancestor of the FF. How much could a Ferrari 408 4RM be worth today? This is a purely hypothetical question, because the cars are factory objects and do not appear at auction. But if one of the 2 prototypes were ever offered in a prestigious sale, the price could be very high. Normal criteria do not work perfectly here. The 408 is not the most beautiful Ferrari, it is not a racing winner, and it does not have the status of a limited road model like the F40 or the 288 GTO. But it is the first four-wheel drive Ferrari and a key technological prototype. A cautious estimate would place its value at several million euros, probably between 3 and 7 million euros, depending on condition, documentation, and the specific example. The yellow prototype with the aluminum chassis could be valued higher, because it is more technically groundbreaking and better known. At an exceptional auction, with strong storytelling and interest from Ferrari collectors, the figure could rise even further. In practice, however, for the Ferrari Museum, such a car is priceless. The Ferrari 408 4RM remains one of the most interesting hidden chapters in Maranello history. It was not a beautiful styling dream. It did not become a production model, and for years it remained in the shadow of far better-known Ferraris. But its importance is enormous. It was the first Ferrari to show that the company could seriously study four-wheel drive, bonded aluminum structures, active aerodynamics, adjustable suspension, and new ways of building sports cars. Many of these themes returned later. Aluminum in the 360 Modena, the longitudinal V8 in the 348, the 4RM drivetrain in the FF, and more broadly, the idea of Ferrari as a brand that can combine tradition with technological courage. The 4RM was too strange, too early, and too controversial for its time. But that is exactly why it is fascinating. It was a Ferrari that was not meant to impress customers, but to ask questions about the future. And although it never reached the market, many of the answers it produced were used by Maranello many years later.